Hi, everybody. Michelle Edmonds here with Idaho News 6. So nice to have you joining us on this Tuesday. Hope you had a great Memorial Day holiday. We are talking all things education, but in this time frame in particular, a lot of that involves politics. We would love to take your comments, your questions, your thoughts about what has transpired in our state over the past week. Here to talk with me about it is Kevin Richert from Idaho Education News. Kevin, we've gone through a year of a pandemic, and now the political machine just seems to be churning, and the two are colliding yet again. So we have to start with everything that went on last week, from the executive order that the lieutenant governor put on a mask mandate, with the governor coming back into town and reversing the mandate. I want to say, since everybody knows pretty much where this has been, my question to you is, where is it going?
Well, I think that's a really good question. And really, I was struck by the timing of all of this because Lieutenant Governor Janice McGeachin pinned a lot of her repeal of the mask mandates around the idea of allowing kids to be in school without masks. Well, the fact of the matter is, in a lot of school districts, local administrators, local educators have already lifted mask mandates. And a lot of schools are out for the summer anyway. I mean, the mask issue is still very much an issue in West Ada, where students are required to wear masks indoors and school is in session until next week. So that is still an active issue. But in a lot of school districts and a lot of schools, this really is kind of a moot point at this stage.
What was the reaction that you and the reporting staff heard at Idaho Education News over what happened in the schools because of the communication that was honestly one day one thing, one day another thing? It sent some districts, specifically I'm talking about West Ada, I know because they put out an email about it, into a bit of turmoil.
There was a lot of confusion because school officials say that they had no idea that Lieutenant Governor McGeachin was going to repeal the mask mandates. They found out when the rest of the world found out on Thursday morning. So you're right. You had the West Ada School District come out on Thursday saying, we're not going to change our policy here midday. We don't know what's exactly going on. You had the Idaho School Boards Association come out later that day saying that, in their view, they didn't even think that McGeachin's executive order applied to school districts at all, because school trustees have statutory powers and constitutional powers with regard to student safety and student health and welfare that would override anything that comes from an executive order. So the order was not in place for very long, but in the time that it was in place, it sparked a lot of confusion.
Again, moving forward as we get into the political season, with McGeachin announcing that she is going to run for governor, presumably against Brad Little and whoever else is going to get into that race.
Right. There are a lot of people in the race, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Exactly. Where does this fall down with the issue of local control, where the governor has stood since the beginning on this pandemic, giving local control, whether it be school boards or health districts, over to all of these different issues? How does this play out?
I think those are some of the talking points that we heard last week, and I think we'll probably hear in the future. Governor Little has said that his decision to not require masks or to issue any kind of a statewide mask mandate was a bow to local control, to allow local governments, including local school districts, to decide what to do in their communities, what made sense in terms of the pandemic at the local level. So I think you're going to hear the local control issue. I think you're also going to hear the separation of powers issue. And here it was kind of turned on its head because Lieutenant Governor McGeachin has been very outspoken, very critical of the governor for his use of executive powers, for his use of executive orders during the pandemic. Well, here you had Lieutenant Governor McGeachin issue an executive order that overrode anything that had been decided, or attempted to override anything that had been decided at the local level. So, you're right. We're almost a year out from the Republican primary, and it's on. It started. It's very clear what kind of a race we're looking at here.
Well, and that goes to the announcement last week, too, of Scott Bedke getting into the race for lieutenant governor. So you've got the two top spots really heating up.
And if you wanted to see the division within the Republican Party on full display, you needed only to be at Scott Bedke's announcement for lieutenant governor. On the one hand, you had former Governor Butch Otter, a longtime lieutenant governor in his own right, introduce Bedke. Otter is, I believe, going to be Bedke's campaign manager, if I recall this correctly. Clearly, Otter and Bedke closely aligned. You had several key legislators in attendance at Bedke's announcement, including House Majority Leader Scott Bedke. I spoke to him afterwards, and he said, yes, he's definitely endorsing Bedke. So you had this Republican power structure, clearly lining up behind Bedke, whereas at the same time you had supporters of Priscilla Giddings showing up at the announcement with signs, not just pro-Giddings signs, but from very blunt anti-Bedke signs saying that Bedke is a rhino, he's a Republican name only, he's for tax increases. You got a real clear sense of the divisions within the Republican Party right at that announcement. And very unusual to have that kind of tension between supporters of one candidate and supporters of another candidate from the same party at a campaign announcement. So I think we're in for an election year unlike anything we've seen before.
And that's unique coming from a very red state, because as you and I well know, covering politics in this state for the past 15, 20, 25 years, this is setting up to have some divisions in it like I don't remember. I mean, to say that somebody has come into office because they basically have been handed the job is not putting it lightly in years past. So I think you're exactly right, Kevin. I mean, it's already gotten heated, and we're within the first week of McGeehan announcing her candidacy for governor.
In some ways, this has been building for a long time simply because, obviously Idaho's a very Republican state. You have to go back to 1998 let me correct myself. You have to go back to, I think it's 2002, let me be clear, to have a Democrat win statewide office. Either way, we're 20 years out from Democrats winning a statewide office. So that's why there's so much attention paid to these Republican primaries. And Idaho's Republican primary is now a closed primary. You have to align, you have to declare your allegiance with the Republican Party in order to vote in that primary. So what happens in the primary next May could very well determine who gets elected. I mean, that's been what we've seen over the past few years. That if history is your guide, you would say that what happens in these Republican primaries is going to determine who's in charge for the next 4 years. It's going to be a wild primary.
It's going to be a wild next year. So let's talk about politics again, kind of bleeding over into education as well. They should, but in this case, we had talked last week about the indoctrination task force. It's officially being called the Task Force to Examine Indoctrination in Idaho Education. This, of course, again, being put out and spurred on by the lieutenant governor. The task force happened last Thursday, but what now, Kevin? Do we see this meet again?
They will meet again, and they will meet again over the next 3 months. So you will have meetings in late June, late July, and late August. The late June meeting will focus on K-12 and are there problems of indoctrination in the K-12 system. Then late July, similar meeting focused on higher education. Then end of August, the task force meets one last time to look at any kind of recommendations, any kind of policy recommendations that may come forward. I think I wasn't terribly surprised. I wasn't at the entire task force meeting, or Blake Jones covered it from start to finish. I was there for at least part of it because I was also covering other stuff on Thursday. I'm still struck by who's at the table and who isn't at the table. And this is something I wrote about last week, about how several education groups wanted to be on the task force or decided consciously to not even seek to be on the task force. So it's a pretty selective group. It's a pretty tilted group towards towards the right. You have many members of this committee, when they spoke about their backgrounds, spoke very clearly and very candidly about their belief that indoctrination is a problem right now. So this is not exactly an objective, unbiased group that's coming to look at this issue.
How much power do they have?
Who really knows? Because there really is no clear mechanism for anything that comes out of this task force to be considered at the state level. We routinely see, and we'll see again this summer, you'll see legislative interim committees. Those are put together by the legislature for the legislature, with the idea that this is a group that's been put together to look at a difficult issue, to look at a complicated issue, to work on it during the off season and come back with legislation for the following year. At least there's a path for that legislation to be considered. Doesn't mean it's going to pass. We've seen a lot of interim committees come up empty in terms of getting something passed through the legislature. This isn't even that. It's this group that the lieutenant governor has put together on the side. Certainly it's going to get attention. We're going to watch it closely, simply because I think we have to watch it closely. And I think we have to look closely at what's being said. What is the evidence? What is the proof? What's where's the hard evidence to support what's being pushed out of this task force?
I'm going to be fascinated to watch that as well. Let's jump out of the political landscape for a little bit and talk about actually a couple of really interesting stories that probably flew under the radar for most people when it came to following education in the last week, because of all of the political wranglings that were happening with education strings attached to them. But specifically, Kevin, the J.A. and Catherine Albertson Foundation decided that they were going to give out grants for all-day kindergarten, and they are now going to support 1,000 Idaho students to have all-day kindergarten. First and foremost, we should probably mention the money attached to Idaho Education News coming from the J.A. and Catherine. Would you like to make your disclaimer before we talk about
full
this?
Disclosure, the Albertson Foundation does fund Idaho Education News. They do not oversee our content. They do not have editorial control over our content.
There you go. That's our disclaimer. And now, the fact that they have decided to put out these grants. I found the school list kind of fascinating. Can you talk a little bit about how the process went down for deciding what schools get these grants for all-day kindergarten?
Right. So it's a $1.4 million group of grants, and it's going to go to 17 charter schools around the state. It's a continuation of, we've talked about it so many times over the past years, the concept of trying to expand into all-day kindergarten. You have a lot of school districts already doing this, but this funding goes specifically to charter schools around the state to advance the idea of all-day kindergarten.
How much of a difference will it make?
Well, the foundation is hoping that this is going to reach out to, I'm looking at my story to make sure I've got my exact number. They think that this is going to reach about 1,000 students. So that's a pretty big group. When you think about, we have about 20,000 maybe kindergarten students around the state. If you're reaching 1,000 kindergarten students through these grants, well, that's 5% of your incoming kindergarten class.
Are there some political strings attached to this? Meaning, Kevin, obviously there was the debate over whether or not to take federal money for early learning. Is the J.A. and Catherine Albertson Foundation hoping to make hay with this and show people what funding all-day kindergarten could do?
I think to a large degree that debate is going to continue at the state level, but I think there's a lot of sentiment at the State House about all-day kindergarten. I think it's a very different debate when we start talking about all-day kindergarten as opposed to early education when we talk about pre-K. I think you've got already a good number of legislators, a critical mass of legislators who believe that all-day kindergarten is important. and it's something that we should figure out a way to fund. There was a bill that was being floated around this legislative session, didn't go anywhere, supported by some pretty conservative Republicans wanting to fund all-day kindergarten, to get that funded at the state level as opposed to being funded by local property taxes. So I don't think it's quite the same debate where we're talking about all-day kindergarten, but I think this is further evidence that you've got folks in the education world who believe that this is an important investment and an important place to invest money. So the 1.4 million, trying to reach 1,000 kindergarten students, I think it does add another element to this debate.
The other story I wanted to quickly talk with you about was the University of Idaho's decision, well, and for that matter, the state board approved it, that they're going to go into partnership with Alaska Airlines. And we're not talking about like a football sponsorship or naming a building or anything like that. The University of Idaho literally wants to make sure they have service brought back to the Pullman Airport. And this has a lot of different things attached to it, specifically looking at trying to get more students to come to the University of Idaho. But also there are some people who think that this needs to be done in order to make sure that lawmakers or policymakers can move around the state better. This is fascinating to me, Kevin.
It really is an interesting story. And, with everything else that was happening on Thursday, I don't know if it really got the kind of attention that it deserved. But what State Board agreed to support is a plan from the University of Idaho, a contract that they're reaching with Alaska Airlines that would bring air service back to that Pullman airport, linking Pullman with Boise. Right now, you can't get from there to here, at least by Alaska Airlines. And you haven't been able to do that for several years. So what the University of Idaho has agreed to do is that if Alaska Airlines holds up its end of the bargain and provides at least 5 flights linking Boise and Pullman every week, that the University of Idaho is going to guarantee up to $500,000 a year for 3 years to the airline if the air service to Pullman doesn't meet its targets for profitability. And I think it's like a 10% profit margin that the contract calls for as a minimum. So why is the University of Idaho getting into this business? Well, you hit on it. The U of I believes that they need this link to Boise to help get students to and from the campus. They feel like they've been losing out on students from the Treasure Valley who might be willing to go to the University of Idaho if they had the option of being able to fly to and from, or their parents had the option of being able to fly their kids to and from. It's a long drive from Boise to Moscow. It's a beautiful drive. I've done it many times, but in bad weather, it's a little bit of a white knuckle drive. So they hope that this will help attract students. They also believe that it will help the researchers at University of Idaho when they have to do business travel to meet with research partners off campus. They can get from Moscow to a lot more cities once they get to Boise. And the U of I also says, look, we need to get our employees, our officials down to Boise for legislative hearings or for State Board of Education meetings. So for a lot of reasons, the University of Idaho thinks that this is an important link, but it's an unusual relationship. I was really kind of surprised to see it on the agenda, surprised to watch the State Board hearing about it. It was a very quick hearing, not many questions from the board to the University of Idaho, and ultimately it was approved unanimously. Bottom line here is, with this contract, you could see this air service resume as early as August, which would be right before the start of the school year.
Which that timing makes sense. I just wonder if there are going to be people who are saying, this is how we're using tax dollars. And like you reported, not necessarily will the University of Idaho be handing over a check to Alaska Airlines, but the president was pretty clear that there could very well be money in the end that has to be given.
Right. So when we talk about $500,000, that's the maximum per year for 3 years. Scott Green, the president of University of Idaho, told the state board that he doesn't think that it's going to come to that it's not going to be that high end. But he said that there's a pretty good chance, that the university is going to have to, send some money to Alaska Airlines to honor its end of this contract. How much, we'll see.
Yeah.
And the plan is that this is going to basically come out of the University of Idaho's budget. It's general operating budget. They feel like they can find places to save, to move some money around, to come up with the money. So it is, it is general fund money from the University of Idaho going to a private airline.
I'm sure they're looking to track and see in the 3-year time period too, if it does make a difference in all the ways they hope it will,
Right.
to see if that ends up extending a contract as well.
Yes. So it's something we'll definitely want to watch more closely as it unfolds.
What else are you guys working on in Idaho Education News? I'm sure there's nothing happening right now that school's out. You guys are on summer recess. I'm kidding.
Right. Yeah, there's very little that we're doing. So coming up this week, I'm going to sit down with Beth Oppenheimer, the executive director of the Idaho chapter of the Association for the Education of Young Children. They were the group behind the $6 million federal grant for early education that the legislature killed this year. So I'm going to sit down and talk to her for my podcast that will air on Friday about what happened here and where does the group go from here in terms of trying to move early education in the state without this $6 million grant. So that's my podcast on Friday, working ahead on a project that will run hopefully in the next couple of weeks here in June, looking at higher ed enrollment during the pandemic. I'm going to sit down and start to actually finally write this project that I've been working on around the longest legislative session in state history.
Kevin, we appreciate all that you and the folks at Idaho Education News are doing to keep us informed. Of course, if you'd like to hear more about all of these stories, you can read about them at idahoednews.org, and we do links constantly at Idaho News 6 to the Idaho Education News website. Really appreciate your time, Kevin, and happy unofficial kickoff to summer, my friend.
Yes, same to you.
Thanks, everybody, for being here for Making the Grade.